The knock came softly at first, a single tap on the wooden door of Aiden Nor's apartment, but its echo moved through him like a quiet ripple of tension. He froze mid-step, his breathing shifting without permission, as if a part of him had suddenly braced for impact. It wasn't fear, not in the dramatic sense. It was something subtler, an internal tightening, a quiet refusal rising from somewhere deeper than thought. Aiden glanced toward the entrance, but instead of walking toward it, he instinctively stepped back, as though the simple presence of another human being on the other side had pushed too close to a line he didn't want crossed. He didn't dislike people. Anyone who knew him would describe him as warm, composed, thoughtful, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. But there was something about someone wanting to enter his home, his private world, that created a strange inner resistance he couldn't explain aloud. His apartment was small, quiet, filled with soft light and shelves of old books. It was the place where his mind breathed, where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. And the moment someone asked to step into that sanctuary, his energy shifted. It was as if the air inside him recoiled, saying, "Not now. Not here." The knock came again, firmer this time. Aiden felt that familiar sensation, a gentle pressure behind his ribs, the sudden awareness of his own heartbeat, the strange mix of guilt and irritation that visited him only in these moments. He wasn't angry. He wasn't anxious about the person outside. He was simply unwilling to open the door without always knowing why. And yet, a voice inside whispered, "You should answer." It's rude not to. That inner debate between what he genuinely felt and what he believed he was expected to do played like a quiet conflict in his chest. This is a feeling millions experience but rarely admit. That moment when the idea of someone entering your space feels heavier than any social obligation can justify. A discomfort not rooted in dislike, but in a need to protect something invisible within yourself. And yet, for most of his life, Aiden thought he was alone in this. That there was something unusual, perhaps even flawed, about preferring solitude so intensely that a simple visit felt like an intrusion. But today's reflection, built on the teachings of Dr. Aurelius Jungston, a thinker inspired by the foundations of Carl Jung's psychology, reveals something deeper, something human, something meaningful. Aiden's discomfort is not a personality defect. It is a signal from the psyche, a whisper from the inner world that something sacred is being guarded. Many people feel this, but hide it behind practiced smiles and polite invitations. However, Jungston's insight says the opposite. This resistance is natural, ancient, and often a sign of inner evolution rather than emotional weakness. Imagine a person who thrives in gatherings, who lights up at the sound of a knock on the door. Their energy flows outward, connecting effortlessly with the world. But for others, people like Aiden, energy moves inward, returning to deeper source. Their home becomes more than a shelter. It becomes a sanctuary where their inner order resets itself. Any unexpected presence disrupts that delicate balance. Aiden didn't know it yet, but the simple act of not wanting a visitor was revealing a psychological truth. Some people don't protect their home protects them. It shields their quiet mind, their emotional landscape, their unfolding transformation. In this story, we begin exploring 6 profound insights from Jungston's philosophy about why some souls feel this resistance, and why it may actually indicate that your inner life is maturing, expanding, and strengthening. Because if you've ever felt guilty for wanting to be alone, you may discover today that it isn't avoidance at all. It is your soul choosing peace over performance, truth over pressure, and self-preservation over unnecessary noise. And sometimes, the first step in understanding yourself begins with acknowledging the simplest truth. Not every door is meant to be opened. Not every knock deserves an answer. Aiden sat down slowly on the edge of his sofa after the knocking faded, feeling the silence of his apartment settle around him like a warm blanket. It was only then that he noticed the strange sensation that always followed these moments, a quiet exhaustion, as though his mind had been preparing for a performance he never wanted to give. He stared at the muted lamplight on the wall and wondered, not for the first time, why the simple idea of letting someone inside felt so draining. It wasn't because the visitor was unpleasant. It wasn't because he feared conversation. It was something much deeper, something he could only feel, not articulate. This is where the teachings of Dr. Aurelius Jung begin to illuminate the truth. Jung believed that the human psyche does not distribute energy equally among all people. Rather, each of us has a direction in which our inner energy naturally flows. Some people send their energy outward. Their minds expand effortlessly into the world around them. The sound of conversation, the presence of others, the movement of social life, all of it nourishes them. They bloom in external light. But others, those like Aiden, possess an entirely different architecture. Their energy flows inward, always returning to a deep center inside them. Silence is fuel. Solitude is oxygen. Reflection is nourishment. When this kind of person is exposed to too much external stimulation, long conversations, sudden visits, energetic people, demands for attention, their inner structure begins to overload. Not because they are weak, but because they're wired differently. Jung described this beautifully. Some souls recharge in the world, while others recharge from within it. A single sentence that explains an entire life. For individuals like Aiden, the home becomes more than a physical structure. It transforms into a sanctum of psychic recalibration, a place where their scattered emotional threads slowly weave back together. When someone steps into that space, even with kindness, even briefly, the inward flow of energy must be redirected outward. A shift occurs, a disturbance. Suddenly the psyche must activate alertness, politeness, attention, awareness. The quiet rhythm of inner life is interrupted, and the person is thrust into a mode of social orientation. This is why Aiden felt tired at the thought of opening the door. Not because he disliked the visitor, but because opening the door meant closing off his inward flow. Imagine a small, peaceful river flowing within a forest. It carries just enough water to move gently, nourishing everything around it. When someone enters an introvert space unexpectedly, it is like diverting that river into a sudden waterfall. The energy shifts violently. The river loses its calm, its clarity, its direction. It is forced to become something else, something loud, fast, externally focused. That's why the knock felt heavy. That's why conversation felt draining. That's why even the thought of welcoming a visitor made something deep inside him recoil. It is not rudeness. It is not antisocial behavior. It is not a lack of love or warmth or generosity. It is energy physics, the law of where your soul sends its power. In the world's eyes, introversion is often misunderstood as shyness. But Jung insisted that introversion has nothing to do with shyness. It is about survival. For some people, solitude is not an escape from the world. It is the place where their inner life repairs itself. When Aiden sat alone, he wasn't hiding, he was healing. He felt this instinctively, but never had the words for it. When visitors came, his entire being shifted into a different mode. His breathing subtly changed, his shoulders stiffened, his mind prepared itself to host, as if a switch had been flipped. That switch, that forced outward movement, was the real exhaustion. And here lies the key truth. When your natural flow of energy is inward, every external demand costs you psychic currency. Aiden's quiet resistance was not a flaw, not a mistake. It was an unconscious attempt to preserve the balance of his inner architecture. And though he didn't yet understand it, this instinct would guide him through deeper truths, ones involving his shadow, his hidden emotions, and the sacred nature of his inner space. For now, all he knew was this: when the world pulls on your energy and your soul pulls you inward, the discomfort is not inconsistency, it is clarity. That evening, as the air in Aiden's apartment returned to stillness, he felt something he had learned to recognize only through sensation, never through words, a faint uneasiness that lingered even after the knocking stopped. It sat beneath his calm like a quiet tremor, subtle but undeniable. Most people would have brushed it off as nothing. But Aiden had lived long enough inside his own silence to know that this tremor always appeared when someone tried to enter his space. It was not annoyance. It was not fear. It was something older, deeper, and strangely intimate. Dr. Aurelius Jungston called this concealed layer of his psyche the quiet twin, his reimagined term inspired by Carl Jung's shadow. The quiet twin was not an enemy or a dark monster lurking in the unconscious. Instead, Jungston described it as a silent companion, a reservoir of everything we have tucked away, forgotten fears, unspoken disappointments, buried sensitivities, memories that still hum beneath the surface, and versions of ourselves the world never gave room to exist. Most people believe discomfort comes from the visitor, the person standing at the door. But according to Jungston, the visitor is merely the trigger, not the cause. The real movement happens inside. When someone tries to enter your home, your private sanctuary, it is not just the physical space they step into. Their presence brushes against the quiet twin, stirring parts of you that usually remain undisturbed. Every voice carries its emotional history. Every body brings its own silent storms. Every person carries unseen tensions, expectations, and moods. And your psyche, more sensitive than you imagine, picks up on all of it. Aiden often felt this as a soft internal pressure, like someone plucking at strings of an instrument he didn't know was still tuned. Visitors brought with them energies he hadn't prepared for, energies he would have to absorb, interpret, or navigate. And some part of him instinctively resisted that intrusion. It wasn't the visitor he avoided. It was the internal reaction they provoked. Jungston wrote in one of his notebooks, "A disturbance in the outer world always awakens a buried chord within." These buried chords, the unmet needs, hidden vulnerabilities, and subtle sensitivities, live in the quiet twin. And the quiet twin awakens whenever someone gets too close. Imagine this. You let someone sit in your living room. You make tea, you smile, you listen. But inside, your quiet twin is watching, feeling, sensing every shift in tone, every strand of emotion, every unspoken dynamic. A visitor may unknowingly carry sadness in their posture, irritation in their breath, or unresolved tension in their silence. And your psyche, sharp and perceptive, feels all of it like a sudden temperature change in the room. This is why discomfort often rises inexplicably, not because the visitor is harmful, but because something inside you is stirred. Aiden had experienced this countless times. A visitor's casual comment would nudge a forgotten memory. Their nervous laughter would echo something unresolved in his own life. Their restless energy would disrupt the calm he spent all day building. And before he even knew why, he would feel a strange agitation rise, not directed at them, but triggered by what their presence awakened in him. This is the essence of the shadow, not darkness, but unresolved light, not evil, but unintegrated truth. The quiet twin becomes active when someone enters your space because home is the one place where your guard is down. It is where your deeper self rests without armor. Visitors unintentionally walk through emotional rooms they cannot see, brushing against curtains of old experiences, stepping on tiles of forgotten sensitivity, opening inner drawers you didn't know were unlocked. This is why Aiden often needed hours of silence after a visit. Not because the guest was unpleasant, but because the quiet twin had been awakened and needed time to settle again. Jungston explained that when your quiet twin reacts, your body interprets it as discomfort. You feel invaded, even if the visitor did nothing wrong. You feel restless, even if the conversation was polite. You feel the urge to retreat, even if everything appeared perfectly normal on the outside. But here is the most important truth. Your discomfort isn't a flaw, it is a message. It means something in your psyche is ready to be acknowledged. The quiet twin does not rise to punish you. He rises to show you what still needs integration. Places where your emotional walls are thin, memories that need gentleness, boundaries that deserve respect, sensitivities that are valid and alive. So when Aiden felt that subtle tremor within him, he wasn't experiencing weakness. He was witnessing the quiet twin wake up, a reminder that even silence has layers and every knock on the door touches more than just wood. Later that night, when the neighborhood finally dipped into its usual quiet, Aiden walked through his apartment with slow, thoughtful steps. It was a simple place, muted colors, warm lamps, shelves lined with books he had collected over the years. But to him, it felt much larger on the inside than it looked from the outside. The rooms held a certain kind of silence, not empty, but full, like a library where every sound has meaning. As he moved from corner to corner, he realized why the idea of someone entering this space always felt like a disturbance. It wasn't just a home. It was something far more intimate. Dr. Aurelius Jungston used a term for this in his writings, the inner fortress. He believed that the physical home often mirrors the architecture of one's psyche, each room representing a different chamber of the self. Not in a literal sense, but in a symbolic one, speaking in the language of the unconscious. The outer hall, the space guests usually see, represents your social self, the version of you that interacts with the world. The inner chamber, the quiet bedroom, represents your truest emotions, your vulnerability, your dreams. The lower vault, often unseen or unvisited, mirrors the unconscious, forgotten memories, fears, instincts. The skylight room, the place where sunlight rests the longest, symbolizes your higher thoughts, clarity, your longing for meaning. And then there is the front gate, the threshold, the line between two worlds. When someone crosses that threshold, they are not merely entering your living room. Symbolically, they're stepping into the corridors of your inner fortress. Even if they don't know it, even if you don't realize it consciously, the psyche recognizes that an other has entered its symbolic territory. This is why the air changes the moment a visitor steps inside. It is not their footsteps you hear, it is the sound of the fortress adjusting. Aiden often felt this shift even before the guest spoke. As soon as someone walked in, the silence reshaped itself. The light behaved differently. The atmosphere thickened, as if a foreign energy had mingled with his own. And this wasn't superstition or imagination. Jungston insisted that sensitive or introspective individuals notice these micro-changes instinctively. The unconscious is always scanning, always perceiving what the conscious mind has not yet named. Visitors bring stories with them, invisible stories. Their days, frustrations, their unspoken thoughts, their internal storms, their unresolved emotions. They don't leave these at the door. They carry them into your space, and your inner fortress feels every vibration. This was why Aiden's sanctuary felt so precious. He did not protect it out of selfishness. He protected it because it kept him whole. Every room of his home symbolized a part of him that worked quietly throughout the day to maintain balance, to restore him, to piece together what the world scattered. The living room, where he often sat with tea and silence, was the chamber where he processed the world. The small desk by the window was the place his thoughts aligned. The dim-lit hallway was where his mind transitioned from outer life to inner life. Untouched corners held memories, hopes, and ideas still forming. When someone entered, even with kindness, they stepped into all of that. They rearranged the inner air. They touched invisible threads. They stood in the middle of a symbolic landscape they didn't even know existed. And the psyche felt it instantly. This is why Aiden's atmosphere shifted so sharply with guests. It wasn't the conversation, it was the intrusion upon the symbolic inner structure his mind had built. The inner fortress is not built of stone. It is built of silence, memory, intuition, and psychological restoration. And when someone walks into it, the fortress must open walls it did not intend to open. Jungston believed that sensitive souls require their inner fortress to stay intact so they can function in the outer world. Thus, when someone enters their physical home, the psyche treats it as a deep intrusion, even if the guest is kind, even if the visit is short, even if everything seems normal. Because in the symbolic language of the unconscious, your home is another word for your soul. Aiden touched the cold edge of his bookshelf as this realization unfolded quietly within him. He finally understood why even small visits left him feeling unsettled for hours. It wasn't that he rejected people. It was that he felt the unconscious impact of their presence. A presence that stirred the rooms of his inner fortress, each one representing a delicate psychological process that required peace, order, and solitude. And so, tonight, as he stood alone in his softly lit apartment, he realized something important. His need for privacy was not a weakness. It was wisdom. It was preservation. It was a form of quiet self-respect. Because every fortress has a gate, and every gatekeeper deserves the right to choose who enters and when. The next morning, as sunlight slid softly across the wooden floor, Aiden stood before the small mirror near his hallway. He wasn't checking his reflection out of vanity. He was noticing something deeper, the change in his expression whenever he imagined someone knocking again. His face tightened in subtle ways. His jaw stiffened. His eyes narrowed slightly. The muscles around his mouth prepared themselves to form a polite smile. It was a reflex, one he had trained over many years without ever meaning to. A mask that came on the moment he sensed he might need to interact. Dr. Aurelius Jungston had a name for this, the day mask. While inspired by Carl Jung's persona, the day mask represented something even more practical. The social performance each person learns to adopt in order to move through the world smoothly. It was functional, necessary, and even healthy. The day mask helps you commute, work, negotiate, smile, respond, reassure, socialize, and adapt. It is the version of you shaped by societal expectations, family upbringing, professionalism, and the need to fit into shared rhythms. But the day mask has a limit. And the limit shows itself most clearly inside the home, where the soul seeks to be bare. For Aiden, every unexpected visit forced the day mask to activate inside the one place he never wanted to wear it. His home was where he let his shoulders settle, where he allowed silence to speak, where he breathed without performance. But the moment someone crossed his threshold, the invisible mask slid over him automatically. He suddenly had to monitor his tone, choose the right words, regulate his expressions, keep his body language open, avoid awkward pauses, pay attention to the visitor's comfort, stay mentally alert, be socially on. 1,000 tiny tasks, none of which felt natural when performed inside his sanctuary. Visitors didn't see the subtle tension. They didn't see the shift in his breathing. They didn't know that, as he poured tea, he also poured half of his mental energy into maintaining the day mask. On the outside, Aiden appeared calm, polite, and present. But inside, something else was happening. His authentic self retreated, stepping behind the day mask, as though it needed cover from the invasion of social expectations. This retreat drained him faster than any physical task ever could. Jungston wrote that sensitive individuals feel this exhaustion more acutely because their day mask is heavier. It holds more layers, old habits, survival strategies, social anxiety, overthinking, excessive empathy, perfectionism, or simply the desire to avoid conflict. Each layer adds weight, and when forced to wear this mask at home, a place meant for psychological undressing, the exhaustion multiplies. Aiden thought about this as he recalled past visits. He remembered sitting across from a guest, nodding at stories he didn't have the energy to process, smiling even when silence would have felt more honest. He remembered pretending to be comfortable while his soul quietly whispered, "Please, not right now." And the worst part, the guilt. The guilt of wanting someone to leave. The guilt of not wanting to host. The guilt of feeling invaded. But Jungston's work revealed the truth. It was not people he wanted to escape. It was the weight of the day mask. The mask demanded that he present a version of himself he didn't have the energy to sustain. Not in that moment. Not in his sanctuary. Not when his soul was trying to rest. The day mask protects you outside, but suffocates you inside. Aiden felt those words echo inside him like a quiet awakening. He realized how much energy he spent performing in his own living room. He wasn't dishonest, but he wasn't fully himself either. He wasn't rude, but he wasn't free. He wasn't antisocial, but he was drained. This is why solitude felt like oxygen. It was the only time he could take the day mask off without consequence, to speak without editing, to breathe without caution, to exist without performance. Jungston's final insight from this chapter resonated with him the most. A soul grows tired not from speaking to others, but from hiding its truth while doing so. And in that moment, Aiden understood the real reason visitors exhausted him. It wasn't because they asked for too much. It was because he gave too much of himself in response, even when he didn't mean to. In the sacred privacy of his home, he wasn't resisting people. He was protecting his authenticity. For the first time, he allowed himself to accept that his exhaustion was not selfishness. It was a form of self-awareness, a quiet, instinctive refusal to betray the parts of him that needed silence to breathe. Aiden sat by his window that evening, watching the slow movement of clouds drifting across a faint blue sky. The light outside had dimmed into that gentle shade where the world feels quieter, softer, almost as if it, too, is exhaling after a long day. In that moment, Aiden felt something unusual, a sense of relief that the day was ending without another unexpected interruption. It was not joy, not excitement, but a deep, grounding peace, the kind that comes from being exactly where you need to be, doing nothing more than breathing in silence. For years, he had suppressed this feeling. He believed that enjoying solitude too much was wrong, that declining visits made him cold, that preferring silence made him less normal. But as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of his apartment, he realized that peace is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of alignment. This is where the teaching of Dr. Aurelius Jungston's inner ascent begins. According to Jungston, the soul grows not in noise, nor in crowds, nor in constant movement, but in phases of intentional withdrawal. These phases are not accidents. They are inner seasons, necessary transitions through which the psyche prepares for its next form. Jungston believed that when a person begins craving silence more than conversation, solitude more than company, and inwardness more than outward visibility, it is rarely a sign of emotional decline. It is the beginning of psychological evolution. He called this phase the ascent. Just as a climber pauses before rising to higher ground, the soul pauses to gather strength before rising into a more authentic version of itself. This made sense to Aiden. Not wanting visitors wasn't about rejecting people. It was about protecting the fragile structure inside him that was rearranging itself. He was not pulling away from the world. He was returning to himself. And returning to oneself, Jungston wrote, is often the first step to becoming whole. As he sipped warm tea, Aiden reflected on the countless times he had said yes when every part of him wanted to say no. The evenings where he forced small talk despite craving silence. The weekends he spent hosting people while his inner voice whispered, "You needed rest." The guilt he carried whenever he closed the door on others but opened it for himself. Society had taught him that availability meant kindness. That presence meant goodness. That saying yes meant being human. But for the first time, he questioned it. Why must kindness always mean self-abandonment? Why must connection always come before inner peace? Jungston taught that the soul speaks in impulses, a sudden desire to be alone, a longing for quiet, a pulling away from social noise, a heaviness at unwanted interaction. None of these are signals of unhealthiness. They are signals of transition, signals that the psyche has begun rearranging its inner architecture, preparing for a deeper truth to surface. Aiden felt this truth stirring inside him like a soft wind moving through the rooms of his inner fortress. The need for silence was not an escape, it was a calling to protect the energy he needed for his own awakening. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that guilt had been his greatest barrier. He had never questioned the guilt. He only questioned his desire for solitude. But solitude was not the problem. The guilt was. He thought back to earlier that week. A friend had asked to stop by, and he declined, giving a polite excuse. At the time, He felt ashamed, but the moment he hung up, he felt his body lighten. His breath deepened. His home felt like a sanctuary again. That relief wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. His soul had chosen itself, and that choice mattered. According to Jung, the inner ascent begins with one simple realization. You are allowed to withdraw. You are allowed to protect your energy. You're allowed to say no without guilt. This was a revelation for Aiden. He had tried for years to meet societal expectations of constant availability. But as he grew internally, those expectations no longer fit the shape of his evolving self. His soul was stretching, maturing, refining itself, and that process demanded space. When a person is changing internally, Jung wrote, the outer world often grows too loud, too demanding, too intrusive. The psyche retreats, not to hide, but to reorganize. And during this reorganization, unwanted visitors feel like turbulence against a fragile structure mid-construction. Aiden finally understood it. He wasn't rejecting the world. He was protecting the part of him that was still being built. In that quiet moment by the window, he allowed himself to feel something he had long denied. He had the right to be alone. He had the right to guard his silence. He had the right to prioritize himself without apology. And for the first time in his life, the thought didn't scare him. It healed him. That night, Aiden dreamed, not a vague mist of images, but something vivid, almost ceremonial. The dream opened onto a vast, silent plain under a sky of deep indigo. There were no houses, no roads, no voices, only an endless stretch of land washed in moonlight. It felt like the world had been stripped of noise, so something more delicate could be heard. And standing in the center of that quiet expanse, with a figure he had never seen before yet somehow recognized instantly. The man was tall, cloaked in a simple gray robe, holding a lantern made of glass, so old it looked as though it carried centuries within it. The flame inside was small, not bright enough to blind, yet not weak enough to flicker. It burned with a steady glow, warm and intimate, like the calm heartbeat of a sleeping soul. Jung called this archetype the Lantern Keeper. The Lantern Keeper did not speak. He simply looked at Aiden with eyes that reflected not judgment, not expectation, but understanding, a rare kind of understanding, the kind that comes from witnessing someone's inner world rather than their outer life. In Jung's philosophy, the Lantern Keeper symbolizes the part of a person that longs for solitude, wisdom, and inner clarity. The Keeper is the guardian of the quiet path, the path walked not by crowds, but by the individual seeking truth in silence. Unlike the loud archetypes of society, the warrior, the performer, the leader, the Lantern Keeper demands nothing. He only illuminates. As Aiden stood there in the dream, he realized something profound. The Lantern Keeper had always been with him. Every time he felt the urge to withdraw, every time he avoided a noisy gathering, every time he chose a quiet corner over a loud room, the Keeper had been calling him inward, guiding him toward himself. But society had taught him to resist that call, to feel guilty when choosing solitude, to apologize for needing rest, to explain himself whenever he closed the door. Yet in this dream, the Keeper's gaze said something entirely different. Your solitude is not a retreat. It is a journey. Aiden watched as the Keeper raised the lantern slightly. The soft glow spread across the field, revealing a narrow path carved into the ground. It was not straight. It curved gently, disappearing into the distance as if it led deeper into the soul rather than forward through the world. The Keeper motioned toward the path, and Aiden felt a quiet pull in his chest. This was the path he had been resisting. The path of introspection. The path of individuation, not as theory or concept, but as lived reality. Jung believed that the Lantern Keeper appears during key transitions in a person's psychological life. When the outer world becomes too loud, when social expectations grow too heavy, when the day mass cracks under its own weight, the Keeper steps forward to guide the soul towards silence, which is the first temple of self-discovery. The Keeper's lantern symbolizes inner light, not brilliance, not perfection, but clarity. a clarity that only silence can provide, a clarity that emerges only when the world is held at arm's length. As Aiden continued to observe the figure, he realized something else, something quietly transforming. His discomfort with visitors was not a flaw. It was the lantern keeper pulling him back to the path whenever the world demanded more from him than his soul could afford to give. Visitors disrupted his inner balance, not because they were unwelcome, but because their presence dimmed the keeper's lantern. When others entered his space, the keeper's guidance became harder to hear. The flame dimmed, the path blurred. In a dream, the keeper held the lantern directly in front of Aiden, its glow illuminating the space between them. And though the figure remained silent, Aiden understood the message deeply, intuitively. To see your own path, you must sometimes walk alone. To hear your inner voice, you must sometimes close the door. To honor your truth, you must sometimes disappoint others. He watched as the keeper turned, walking gently along the curved path. The lantern light moved ahead, leaving a trail of soft gold in the indigo night. With each step the keeper took, the plain grew quieter, and the air grew warmer, as though the world itself approved of this inward journey. When Aiden woke, the dream lingered, not in the dramatic, emotional way dreams often do, but in a clear, grounded way. He could almost still feel the presence of the lantern keeper near the edges of his consciousness, calm and patient, waiting. He finally understood. His longing for solitude was not a sign of emotional fragility. It was the lantern keeper knocking, not at the front door, but at the door of his inner life. And this time, Aiden felt ready to answer. The morning after the dream, Aiden woke with an unusual clarity. Not excitement, not energy, but a softness, like the world had lowered its volume just enough for him to hear something beneath the surface. He stayed in bed for a moment, listening to the stillness around him. The quiet wasn't empty. It had texture, a subtle warmth, a kind of intelligence, as if silence itself were a living presence, breathing with him, speaking to him in a language without words. He rose slowly, making his way to the kitchen where the early sunlight painted golden lines across the table. As he sat with a cup of warm tea between his hands, he realized something that felt both profound and surprisingly simple. He felt alive in solitude. Not numb, not lonely, alive. It made him think of something Jung wrote in his journals. Solitude is not the absence of life. It is where life reorganizes itself. This sentence had once seemed poetic to Aiden, but now it felt like truth. When he was alone, his thoughts didn't scatter. They settled. His emotions didn't overwhelm him. They sorted themselves. His inner world didn't shrink. It expanded. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was a workshop where invisible craftsmen shaped the unfinished parts of him. As he sipped his tea, he imagined this inner process like a mirror lake deep in a forest. When people were around, their voices, their expectations, their moods, the lake's surface rippled, blurring the reflection. But when he was alone, the lake became still enough to finally show him his own face. Solitude didn't just help him think. It helped him recognize himself. This clarity wasn't accessible in conversations, no matter how pleasant. It didn't appear in company, no matter how warm. It arrived only in the quiet, only in the unshared moments where he could listen inward instead of projecting outward. Jung believed that solitude is where the soul does its heaviest work. Not the dramatic work of figuring life out, but the subtle work of weaving together emotional threads, integrating shadow pieces, healing quiet wounds, organizing scattered thoughts, restoring psychic oxygen, recalibrating inner boundaries, remembering forgotten truths, aligning energy, reconnecting to the inner fortress. These processes require silence. They require room. They require a mind unoccupied by performance, social negotiation, or the weight of others' emotional presence. This is why solitude isn't loneliness. Loneliness is starvation of connection. Solitude is nourishment of self. Aiden began noticing this difference more clearly as the day unfolded. He walked through his apartment with awareness he'd never given it before, sensing how the quiet room seemed to reflect his inner state. The afternoon light in his study, the soft hum of the heater, the distant murmur of the world outside, all of it formed a landscape where his thoughts could breathe. For the first time, he recognized the strength solitude gave him. Not the strength to fight, not the strength to endure, but the strength to be. He felt a gentle confidence inside him, not loud or aggressive, but steady, like a flame sheltered from wind. This was a different kind of power, a quiet one, born not from being seen by others, but from seeing himself clearly. He realized something essential. When he avoided visitors, he wasn't avoiding people. He was protecting the inner lake. Because once the surface ripples, the reflection disappears. The more he embraced solitude, the more he understood its gifts. In silence, he could think without interruption. In stillness, he could feel without defense. In privacy, he could exist without mask. The world around him insisted that constant connection was the path to happiness. That being busy meant being successful. That being surrounded meant being loved. But the deeper he went into himself, the clearer it became. Solitude was not an escape. It was a return to clarity, a return to authenticity, a return to the parts of him that had waited patiently beneath the noise. He remembered the lantern keeper from his dream, walking through the quiet plain, holding a small but unwavering light. And suddenly, he understood what the dream had been telling him. The lantern doesn't shine in crowds. It shines in stillness. Solitude was the place he could see his inner light most clearly, not bright, not dramatic, but undeniably real. The more he embraced that light, the more he felt himself becoming whole. And in that moment, Aiden accepted something he had resisted his entire life. There is wisdom in withdrawal. There is truth in quiet. There is healing in being alone. Not because the world is unworthy, but because the soul needs room to breathe before it can meet the world again. A few days later, Aiden found himself sitting on a park bench beneath the gentlest arc of afternoon sunlight. The sky had settled into a pale blue calmness, the kind that made everything feel lighter, almost contemplative. Children played in the distance, a soft rustle of leaves swayed behind him, and the world seemed to hum with a quiet balance. As he sat watching the scene unfold, he realized something profound. His relationship with solitude had changed, and so had his relationship with connection. He no longer saw solitude as a retreat caused by overwhelm. He saw it as nourishment. But what did that mean for the people in his life? How could he honor his need for silence while still maintaining genuine relationships? Was it possible to do both without sacrificing one or betraying the other? These questions lingered in the air as he sat quietly, letting his thoughts drift. This is where Dr. Aurelius Jung's teaching of the two rivers returned to him, a symbolic understanding that had once felt intellectual but now felt deeply personal. The first river flows inward. It nourishes the self, replenishes the inner world, and brings clarity through solitude. The second river flows outward. It nourishes authentic connection, meaningful conversation, and genuine emotional exchange. Most people, Jung wrote, force both rivers to flow at the same pace, often drowning themselves in social obligations or isolating themselves completely. But a balanced life requires listening to each river's rhythm. Some days, the inward flow must be stronger. Other days, the outward flow becomes necessary. Wisdom is knowing which river needs attention and having the courage to choose accordingly. As Aiden sat on the bench, he felt this truth settle inside him. He didn't need to disconnect from people to honor his need for solitude. He simply needed boundaries that reflected his inner truth, not social expectations. A memory surfaced from the previous week. A friend had texted, asking to stop by. Normally, Aiden would have agreed with a polite smile and a quiet dread. But that day, he had answered differently. I would love to see you, but today I need a quiet evening. Let's meet this weekend instead. He had pressed send expecting guilt, but instead, he felt an unexpected wave of relief. And even more surprising, his friend responded warmly. Of course. Rest well. This weekend works. It was the first time Aiden realized that boundaries were not barriers. They were bridges, but only when communicated with honesty and courage. Jung described boundaries as transparent walls. They let the right light in and keep harmful noise out. They protect without isolating. They allow connection without suffocation. Aiden began applying this idea softly, carefully. He no longer agreed to everything instantly. He paused. He listened inward. He asked himself, which river needs me today? And the more he practiced this inner listening, the more natural it became. Some days, he needed solitude, long stretches of quiet mornings, evenings spent with tea and thoughtfulness, walks alone where he could hear his inner voice clearly. Other days, he felt genuinely open to connection, not forced, not drained, but organically ready to share space with others. This shift changed everything, because when he chose connection instead of enduring it, the quality of his relationships deepened. Conversations felt more meaningful. Presence felt easier. Listening felt natural. His day mask didn't activate. His inner fortress didn't tremble. And the quiet twin did not stir in agitation. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pretending. He was engaging, genuinely, respectfully, calmly. This was the difference Jung emphasized. Connection is only authentic when it does not demand the abandonment of self. Aiden also created small rituals to protect his inward river. A morning ritual of silence before speaking to anyone, a corner of his home reserved solely for reflection, a weekly afternoon spent walking alone, a personal rule of answering messages only when emotionally available, a gentle evening practice of journaling. These rituals didn't close his heart. They strengthened it. He realized that boundaries are not about shutting the world out. They're about inviting the world in selectively, intentionally, truthfully. Because every time he honored his need for quiet, his outward river flowed more purely when he chose to connect. Sitting on the park bench, Aiden felt a rare kind of peace. A peace built not from avoidance, but from alignment. A peace born from listening inward first, then outward. He understood at last, the world would always have expectations. But his soul had needs, and those needs deserved to be heard. Boundaries were not selfishness. They were self-respect. They were the art of preserving authenticity while still welcoming genuine connection. In this delicate balance, Aiden discovered something quietly revolutionary. He didn't need to choose between solitude and relationships. He simply needed to choose himself first and let everything else flow naturally from there. The days that followed unfolded gently, almost like a slow sunrise. Nothing dramatic changed in Aiden's outer life. He still woke early, made tea, worked quietly, and walked through familiar rooms illuminated by soft afternoon light. But something inside him had shifted so profoundly that even the simplest moments felt different, clearer, more grounded. It wasn't an epiphany that shouted. It was a truth that settled. One evening, as twilight brushed the walls of his apartment in deep violet shades, Aiden found himself standing in the center of his living room. No noise, no expectations, just silence, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like presence. He took a slow breath, feeling the air move through him in a way that felt intentional, alive. And then, unexpectedly, he felt the dream of the lantern keeper rise again in his memory. Except this time, the scene was different. When he closed his eyes, he did not see the keeper standing on the wide indigo plain. He did not see the robe, the lantern, or the winding path. Instead, he saw something startlingly simple. He saw himself, standing in the same plane, holding the same lantern. At first, the image confused him. That warmed him. That changed him. Because in this moment, Aiden understood the message that Jung had been hinting at all along. The lantern keeper had never been an external figure. He had always been an inner archetype, a quiet part of Aiden's own psyche, a piece of him that had been guiding him toward authenticity, peace, and inner clarity since long before he recognized it. He realized then that solitude wasn't meant to keep him isolated. It was meant to help him rediscover the lantern he had always carried. the lantern that glowed softly whenever he honored his boundaries, the lantern that brightened when he chose the inward river over the outward one, the lantern that dimmed only when he ignored himself in order to please others. This lantern was not brilliance, not confidence, not charisma. It was something more sacred, self-awareness. Jung called this moment the inner reunion, the point in psychological growth where a person finally meets the part of themselves they've been avoiding, suppressing, or misunderstanding. For some, it arrives through crisis. For others, through loss. But for souls like Aiden, gentle, introspective, deeply sensitive, it arrives through solitude. He sat down slowly on his carpet, letting this realization wash over him. He had spent so many years believing solitude made him odd or aloof. Believing refusing visitors made him cold. Believing saying no made him selfish. But now he saw that none of those beliefs were true. His desire for silence had not been a wall. It had been a doorway leading inward, toward parts of himself he had forgotten to nourish, toward truths he had long silenced, toward the lantern he had never learned to trust. The world had taught him to look outward for meaning. Jung's teachings had reminded him to look inward. But the Lantern Keeper's message showed him something deeper still. He could do both, but only if he honored the inward journey first. As he traced the edges of this understanding, Aiden felt a kind of peace blooming in his chest, slow, steady, rooted. He knew now that solitude was not a temporary phase. It was a lifelong companion, a sacred part of his psychological ecosystem. But he also understood that connection had its place, not forced, not rushed, not obligatory, but authentic, chosen, aligned. He imagined carrying the lantern through the world, not to shield himself from others, but to illuminate the spaces where his true self could exist without distortion. With this inner light, he no longer feared visitors. He simply chose them with intention. He no longer feared connection. He welcomed it when it nourished him. He no longer feared withdrawal. He understood it as healing. And for the first time in his life, he saw solitude not as a hiding place, but as a homecoming. He rose slowly, moving toward the window where night had settled outside in quiet shades of blue. The city lights flickered softly in the distance, like distant constellations, each glowing with its own quiet purpose. And he realized that, just like those lights, every soul shines differently. Some glow in crowds, some glow in solitude, and some, like him, glow most deeply when they carry their lantern within. A soft smile touched his face as he whispered to the quiet room, almost as if responding to a truth he had finally learned to hear. This is who I am, and this is enough. Because in the end, the journey was never about avoiding visitors, never about rejecting the world, never about hiding from connection, but about discovering the light inside him and learning to let it lead. And now, with the lantern in his hands, he finally felt whole.